Parodies can be extremely funny, unless they're making fun of Doctor Who. Hi, this is a Patreon request that got out of hand. I went down the rabbit hole, found myself surrounded with a discombobulated plethora of information that I will now present to you in the most haphazardly way possible. I don't know what the point of this video is. I don't know what I'm trying to get across to you, the viewer. A lot of it isn't Doctor Who related, but it kind of is because Doctor Who exists as the foundation for everything that I'm about to talk about, sort of. We're just going to have to get into it and see what happens. Chosen chimp here. So in the past I've talked about Doctor Who Marvel comics, particularly the ones made in the late 70s and the 80s when those stories really came into their own. Some of the most memorable comic book stories in the Doctor Who universe of all time. But Doctor Who wasn't the only intellectual property that Marvel Comics had under their wing at this point. They also had an assortment of Star Wars comics, and a little bit later on they would have this entire explosive series of Transformers comics as well. And that is just two IPs that Marvel Comics got a hold of. And while all of this was going on, Marvel still had their own in-house character universe to consistently put across to the audience, which they did diligently and are still doing now. And it was one such Marvel comic back in 1981 that paid particular homage to one very niche British sci-fi institution, and I think you know which one I'm talking about. Thank you so much to JRC for requesting this topic over on Patreon. For just £1 a month, you can become a distinguished follower and request your Doctor Who topic for coverage. Your name will be mentioned in the video and your contribution will go towards making this channel a bigger, smarter, brighter, better smelling, and in the case of this video, infinitely more interesting place to be for you, the Doctor Who fan. In the 1970s, Marvel Comics would create two initially separate superheroes, with the intention of tapping into two different subcultures which appeared to be piquing the interest of mainstream American audiences. The first was Luke Cage, aka Power Man, a bulletproof black dude living on the streets of Harlem who would fight villains on his own turf and also stand against miscarriages of justice and corruption within the law system. This character was based on many blaxploitation films of the early 70s, such as Shaft, Superfly, and many others. The other character was Danny Rand, aka Iron Fist, a super rich American white dude who would lose his parents in a plane crash and find himself adopted by an ancient Asian community who had secret powers of kung fu that the rest of the world knew nothing of. Iron Fist would eventually adopt the power of Kunlun and become a superhero fighting similar battles to Luke Cage on the street of New York and the rest of the world. And the intention with Iron Fist was, of course, to tap into America's growing interest with Kung Fu and the excitement accompanying Kung Fu as seen in martial arts movies. Interestingly enough, the first Iron Fist comic was published just 1 year after the death of Bruce Lee. Now, it would be completely wishy-washy of me to exclude the fact that many people considered both of these characters to be somewhat problematic. The trouble with Iron Fist was that the entire Asian community, whilst being represented as something mysterious and appealing, was all geared towards helping the Great White Hope. The Asian characters weren't the heroes themselves, they were there just to propagate the abilities of the white-bread American dude. And as far as Luke Cage was concerned, he was regarded by some, particularly in the black communities, as a bit of a misfire, as a bit of a over-glamorized portrayal of how the black community acted and spoke. The speech and the dialogue was an over-exaggerated version of the representation that black communities in places like Harlem really wanted. Stroke needed. I mean, that was me desperately trying to explain something that is way beyond my intellectual capacity to understand. If you want to read up on those things properly, then there's plenty of resource. And one such article I found, which was great, was written a few decades ago by black comic artist Christopher J. Priest, who wrote a great blog all about the ups and downs of the Luke Cage character. Definitely worth a read if you want the true story on these Marvel characters and what they really meant to the audiences that they were supposed to represent. However, both of these characters were appealing and three-dimensional in their own right, and ultimately they would stand the test of time. But it was a bit of a rocky road to begin with. The sales of both the Iron Fist and the Power Man comics dwindled, and therefore the plan emerged to merge both these characters together. And so Iron Fist hopped over onto the Power Man comics, and those comics then became Power Man and Iron Fist, a kind of unlikely chalk and cheese duo that would have differences of tactics and opinion and, you know, the type of thing. All good fun, buddies at the end of the day. And buddies they remained for a long time. Whilst the series itself ended in the 80s, there were a few more revivals over the intervening decades. And for a lot of people, including myself, the primary introduction to these two characters came in the form of the Luke Cage and Iron Fist Netflix TV shows of the mid to late 2010s. These shows were under the Defenderverse umbrella. It was a kind of Marvel New York based microcosm of character events which tied in very loosely into the Marvel character universe movies, but was also its own separate entity at the same time. You had all these different TV shows, the plots of which would merge together in a one-off series called The Defenders, which had Iron Fist, Luke Cage, and also Daredevil and Jessica Jones. And also occupying this same character universe, you also had Frank Castle, aka the Punisher, who was sort of hanging on the periphery, just being moody and violent all the time, everywhere. Throughout this entire saga, I felt very emotionally invested, but I gotta say the Iron Fist series was probably the weakest of the bunch. I'm not saying I didn't like it, it was fun in places, but overall, there was some kind of hollow quality to it that I was never able to put my finger on. It was just a little bit boring. Particularly in the second series, where you had the rise of Davos, who was a pivotal villain in the Iron Fist comics. And in the series, Davos was played by none other than Sacha Dhawan. And his portrayal of this character, to me, was pretty weak and flat. And just boring. If he put even 1% of charisma that he did when he played the Master into this particular character, then it would have been a winner for me. But as it stood, throughout this entire saga of Davos, he was just a wet load of grumpy nothing. I'm sorry. But yeah, he was amazing as the Master, so that's no shade on Sacha. I just don't think it was written very well. Luke Cage, on the other hand, I enjoyed very much indeed, especially the second series where I felt like the story and the characters really came into their own. And towards the end of that series, Luke Cage is chatting with his pals in a Harlem barbershop, and who walks through the door? It's none other than Danny Rand, aka Iron Fist himself, hopping over to Luke Cage just like he did in the comics. And this meant that you had an Iron Fist Power Man duo one-off special, just for one episode only, but I personally considered it to be the strongest performance of Finn Jones as Danny Rand in the entire Defenderverse saga. And I remember watching this episode thinking that this is probably the coolest thing that the Netflix Marvel Universe had produced so far. Love it. I digress. I need to stay on point here. Whatever I do, I can't go off topic again. So let's go back to 1981, more specifically December 1981, which saw the release of a Power Man and Iron Fist comic titled Day of the Dreadlocks. So this story starts with Luke Cage and Danny Rand going to see a play. Danny in his superhero outfit at the theatre there, and they get to go backstage after, because the reason why they're seeing this play is to pay a visit to their old friend Robert Diamond, who in this particular play, titled A Day of the Dreadlocks, is playing a mysterious character known as Professor Justin Alphonse Gamble. There he is there, looking decidedly frilly and dandyish, and the dreadlocks, Well, look at them. I mean, from the word go, it's obvious what these guys are supposed to represent. They're like the Daleks, but a bit more Marvelish, a bit more industrial and military-esque. They're a cool design. The tracks, the claws, the helmets. I mean, it's a bit of a misfire because they don't actually contain aliens inside them, but it doesn't matter because they're just props for a play. The characters leave the storehouse where the Dreadlocks propped are kept, and the perspective cuts to a grumpy janitor who is basically just moaning about his life, and then something zaps him and he does the classic comic book aye. Turns out that the Dreadlocks aren't quite the inactive props that we all thought they were. And they seem to have a keen interest in Robert Diamond, or more specifically, the character that he plays. They begin tearing things up, shooting lasers left, right and centre, and chanting the overtly distinct catchphrase of No. This time around, the catchphrase is incinerate. Luke Cage and Iron Fist have their work cut out for here, and we get many a exciting panel depicting various ways that they have to defend themselves and protect their friend from these creatures, until eventually Luke and Danny find themselves cornered in a street where their only refuge of escape is a small bookshop that seems mysteriously wedged in between two other buildings. And this is where the parody nature of this story becomes irrefutable. They step inside the tiny bookshop, and guess what? It's bigger on the inside. Within this physically implausible interior, they find the real Justin Alphonse Gamble, a kind of Mad Hatter looking eccentric fuddy-duddy who you can well tell is British because he drinks tea. And it is here that Professor Gamble explains that he is in fact a time traveller, and so are the Dreadlocks. The Dreadlocks are basically real things, and the mix-up here is that Justin recorded one of his encounters with the Dreadlocks in his diary. A page of this diary got torn out and made into a play because real-life humans thought that this would make a good fictional story, not realising that it was based on an actual account and the Dreadlocks are actually real creatures. The Dreadlocks were then able to use this fictitious veil to teleport into our world and remain in hiding as inactive props in the storehouse. Obviously, they're going to destroy the world and things like that, which means Luke Cage and Iron Fist just need to keep fighting the good fight. But unfortunately, the comic ends when Justin Gamble creates a gizmo that teleports him and the Dreadlocks away from the whole scene, and that is pretty much the end. I mean, as a Doctor Who parody, this isn't fully 100% on the nose. It's more like a homage, an alternate version of what Doctor Who might have looked like in the Marvel Universe, should you wish to canonise it, and I will. The interior of the bookshop isn't really much TARDIS-like, but it's still fun and interesting in its own way. I like the little robot budgie that he's got going on in a cage, and there's a few other little points and nods. There's one particular panel where Professor Gamble talks about having changed in the last few decades, to the shock and fourth wall breakingness of Luke Cage himself. As with many Marvel comics of this era, the story ends on a big chuckle, ha-ha kind of thing, and Luke Cage and Iron Fist decide not to bother explaining what happened to anybody else, because ultimately it involves forces beyond their own understanding, and so Day of the Dreadlocks is pretty much forgotten. It exists as one amoeba within the sprawling organism that is the Marvel comic book universe, an easy place to get lost in, which is why it's very important for this video. I can't get sidetracked. I need to stay on point at all times. Liz Carr is a comedian, TV presenter, and disability rights activist internationally. You might have seen her in interviews with Lorraine Kelly, in TV programmes such as Silent Witness, and she presented her own documentary in 2024, a particularly harrowing documentary titled Better Off Dead. From an audience perspective, there are two different sides of Liz Carr's career. There is the entertaining side, as she has starred in many other fantasy-adjacent TV shows and appeared on amusing quiz shows such as Would I Lie to You? But she has also engaged in very serious debates on platforms such as Newsnight. Context for this comic back in December 1981 when it was published. Here are some other things that were going on at the same time that this comic was published. In November 1981, Doctor Who magazine released a Doctor Who magazine winter special, which amongst other things contained a comic book story titled Minotaurus, which involved a Time Lord attempting to recharge his TARDIS, but then he realised in doing so taps a wealth of energy from a planet who need it more than he does, so he ends up sacrificing himself. Sorry to spoil that for you. And you also had the regular Doctor Who magazine publication in December publishing a comic titled Neutron Knights. Neutron Knights showcased a sci-fi take on the classic King Arthur mythology and featured characters such as King Arthur and also Merlin. Keep in mind, distinguished followers, that this was a fair few years before the TV story Battlefield, which also drew from King Arthur stuff. Two completely separate things. But alongside all of these comics, the most important thing that was happening in the Doctor Who universe during the publication of Day of the Dreadlocks was occurring in TV. Months prior, Tom Baker's Doctor had regenerated into this handsome fella, and audiences were waiting with bated breath for the next series of Doctor Who, which wouldn't come until March 1982, and would showcase the excellent talents of Peter Davison for the first time. This was indeed a very transitionary point for Doctor Who, and the TV stories before the 80s and the TV stories after the 80s would represent how different Doctor Who had become, for better or worse, depending on your opinion. But back to this comic, which rested smack bang in the middle of all of this. I was determined to find some kind of foundation for Day of the Dreadlocks, some kind of rock upon which this was built, and I found that when I looked up the name of the author. Writing Day of the Dreadlocks was female comic book author Mary Jo Duffy. In 2024, Mary Jo Duffy won the Bill Finger Award for Excellence in Comic Book Writing, and her resume in the world of comic books is insane. She has done so much for this comic book industry. She began writing for Marvel back in the 1970s and wrote just a hell of a lot of comics for Marvel alongside a multitude of other Power Man and Iron Fist stories. Later on in her career, she would move on to DC Comics and write for Batman and Superman and a bunch of other DC intellectual properties. And before all of this, she wrote, as far as I can tell, pretty much every Star Wars comic that came out in 1977, a series which predates even The Empire Strikes Back. Later on, she would work on the English version of the classic manga Akira, which can't have been easy, and amongst many other things, she also worked on a series titled Chuck Norris Karate Commandos, the comic that turns you into a movie adaptation if you try and read it. To say that Mary Jo Duffy's contribution to the comics that many people know and love over the past bunch of decades is formidable is probably grossly understating it. But what did you notice here? That's right, not a lot of Doctor Who. In fact, no Doctor Who at all, except for this. The early 80s had a grand assortment of Doctor Who comics under the Marvel print, but all of this was UK based and exclusive to the UK's Doctor Who magazine. In the US, Marvel decided to import Doctor Who comics, colorise them, and present them to an American audiences. But in order to get the head of American audiences round to what Doctor Who exactly was, they needed to present some kind of introduction. And this is what the Marvel Premiere series was all about. It was 4 4 issues in the early 80s, basically introducing audiences to Doctor Who lore. One of the most efficient ways that they decided to do this was to present a write-up delivering a backstory of Doctor Who to the audiences before they jumped into these seemingly sporadic Doctor Who stories. And this is where Mary Jo Duffy came in. She did such a write-up in the first Doctor Who Marvel premiere issue, and it's all about the Doctor. It kind of jumps from the production of Doctor Who through to the fictional Doctor Who lore, telling the story from the William Hartnell era all the way through to Tom Baker, where audiences were stuck at the time, in a very slimline but detailed fashion. But there is one very intriguing part of this write-up, and that is this. What we do know about the Doctor is as follows. He is a Time Lord. Real name? Yeah, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. It's algebra. It's maths, or math. Equations. Little things. Look how tiny the numbers are. It's quite cute, isn't it? Now, where the dickens did she get this from? Well, according to Andrew Rillstone, who is a popular blogger and writer, this comes directly from a book written by Malcolm Hulke and Terence Dix in the early 70s. The Making of Doctor Who was published in 1972, and there is also an audio version that you can listen to. It does exactly what it says on the tin, and amongst other things, it contains a short story titled The Trial of Doctor Who. This story is told through the perspective of a Time Lord and recounts the antics of the Doctor up until the point where he is held on trial as seen in the War Games. In this story, all of the Time Lord's names are mathematical equations. I guess the actual proper names of Time Lords are just created for the benefit of humans like me and you. In this story, it is explicitly stated that the Doctor's real name is this. Who knew? Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that pointy squiggle that looks like a large backwards E is actually an algebraic representation of the word sigma. In the Happiness Patrol, which again was made more than a decade later, the Doctor says that his real name is Theta Sigma. Coincidence? I just don't know, but it's an interesting fact nonetheless. There you go. The Doctor's true name. It is my belief that Mary Jo Duffy used this book as a reference point for her own write-up and got so invested in the Doctor Who universe that she simply had to pay some homage towards it in some fashion. And the fact that she talks quite a lot about the Doctor regenerating in her own write-up means that she can then use this as a reference in the character of Professor Justin Alphonse Gamble. So this is, to me, it's quite a heartfelt representation of Doctor Who. It comes from a very earnest place and created from someone who at the time obviously got quite inspired by the world of Doctor Who. So there you go. So whatever happened to these characters? Well, this wasn't technically the last time you would see Justin Alphonse Gamble. A lot more recently in the Marvel timeline, he would appear once again in a more antagonistic guise, this time in a Deadpool story concerning the TVA. The TVA, also known as the Time Variance Authority, was a thing in Marvel. Parallel universes. Because the Marvel Universe deals a lot in parallel dimensions and parallel universes, Marvel has its own system of keeping all of this in canon and in check. For example, the main Marvel character universe and the universe that us humans are supposed to occupy is generally accepted as the 616 universe. The recent movie Fantastic Four was a story set in a parallel universe, hence the reason why at the beginning of that movie it is stated that this particular Earth is Earth 282. And guess what happens if you go into Google and type in Earth 5556? You get the Doctor Who verse. The entire Doctor Who universe is technically canon, existing within the larger Marvel universe. Now, make of that what you will. It is really just a way of Marvel Comics being smarty pants and trying to assimilate everything into its own continuity, not specifically to be greedy, but just because fans like to gush on that sort of thing. I mean, in the first ever Transformers comic, Spider-Man turns up, for example. And it means you can canonise this and say that the events of Day of the Dreadlocks themselves, which were later renamed as the Incinerators, and the character of Professor Justin Alphonse Gamble can be considered kind of parallel universe versions of our Doctor Who universe, which does technically occupy the larger Marvel universe. And the TVA is kind of a way where you can substantiate that. The time variance authority, as it's known. You see it in Deadpool, the Deadpool movie. Deadpool and Wolverine, that one, the more recent one. That deals heavily in the TVA, which means they were able to assimilate all the intellectual properties of Sony. This has got nothing to do with Doctor Who, I'm sorry. The Luke Cage and Iron Fist TV shows, by the way, they are only linked to this Deadpool movie by about 1 million degrees of separation. You can find the strands that connect these two universes together. The TVA also features heavily in the Loki TV series. The TVA is run by a bunch of bigwigs, sort of serious, higher power people whose real lives have been taken away from them so they can exist in this kind of nullified void of non-existence where the TVA exists in the midst of all of these parallel universes, both good and bad. Oh, my head hurts. Possibly because I'm drinking too much coffee. The TVA concept was explored heavily in the Loki TV series, the TVA being this thing that Professor Justin Alphonse Gamble was later revealed to be a part of. In the second series of Loki, you get to meet some of the higher-ups of the time variance authority, some of the bigwigs, particularly in episode 1. Episode 1 features comedian, actor, TV presenter, and disability rights activist Liz Carr. There she is there, look. And if you look her up, it is revealed that this character's name is Judge Gamble. Liz Carr played the Doctor. She's the Doctor in a Marvel story, hiding in plain sight. Right there. Does Liz Carr even know she's playing the Doctor here? Does Mary Jo Duffy know anything about this? I'm not even sure if they do. And you can also call her that. Told you there wasn't really a point to this video. What? Oh, come on, Chuck. I'm struggling here, mate. Thanks. He's a nice guy when he wants to be. So, wormholes. They're a lot of fun, aren't they? You can type in just about anything regarding obscure trivia of your favourite TV show and you'll get taken down some kind of vortex where there's all kinds of weird facts and funny little things, and it's just really good fun doing that once in a while. If you love Doctor Who and you've seen every TV episode and you're a little bit bored and you have seen the news that there is a Christmas special happening not next Christmas but the Christmas after, and that in itself doesn't really appeal to you in any shape or form, which I fully understand, then this might be a good way of getting back into your favourite fictional creation. Just get on the internet and have a laugh discovering weird things. There's no real rhyme or reason, there's no real point, it's just a good way of discovering things that you never knew before. Completely pointless knowledge that you can share with your friends. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me, this rambling, this pointless exercise, which began as a wonderful Patreon request, and I can't help thinking somehow I ruined it. Anyway, I hope you're all doing well. If you want to check me out on social media, then please visit my Blue Sky page at thechosenchimp.bsky.social. Just have a good time, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and that is it from me. Please take care of yourselves, and for the love of Pete and his world, do, by all means, have a good one.